Could Nic Claxton be making a Defensive Player of the Year push? We are going to break it down with Mat Issa of the Analyst and SB Nation, and he will make a case based on a great article that he wrote about why Claxton is probably one of the more surprising defenders in the league at this point. Get into all of that, but first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie. You don't really care who I am right now. There's no Adam Armbrecht, and that's all right because we brought in Mat Issa from the Analyst, from SB Nation, here to talk, like we heard in the open, about one Mr. Nic Claxton. He is going to back up, hopefully, all the things that Adam and I have been trying to say about Nic Claxton all year. Sometimes you got to bring in the professionals. You got to bring in the experts. You got to bring in the analysts to make the case for you. Matt, how's it going, brother?
It's going great. I have to admit, when you said you got to bring in the professionals, I started looking through the notes to see if you were bringing in a third party here, because I'm just a guy who watches basketball and sometimes writes about it. But
No.
what's up, Doug? Happy holidays. Hope you had a lot of food. Hope you enjoyed some good basketball.
Some background on this real quick. So Matt DM'd last week before the holiday an article. I was actually in New York doing the touristy thing with the family, right? But you know, as always, you got to check out on stuff like that and check into what's happening on Twitter. Matt texted or tweeted over this article he had written about Claxton, and I stopped what we were doing mid Times Square and Rockefeller Center push to read it and thought, oh man, this is awesome. We're going to have this guy on the podcast. He's going to back up and actually kind of more in depth tell us the things that we've been trying to say about Claxton. Before we get to that, Matt, give us a little background on where you are with NBA analyst sort of work these days, because you do a lot of different work for a lot of really great websites. I want people to know sort of like what you're doing and how it's actually not really net centric, which I think actually helps this case even more.
Yeah, so what I try to do, I do freelance journalism, so I'm not married to one website. I write for a bunch of different websites like, SB Nation, Fansided, The Analyst, where this article came out. But I cover the league at large. I don't have a specific team. There are teams I like to watch more in my free time than others, but I try to watch every team as much as possible. And, depending on the week, I'll watch a little bit more of one team because, I'm going to be writing about them. But yeah, so I cover the league at large. I think it gives me I can't go as in depth as you guys do on the day-to-day like happenings with the Brooklyn Nets. I almost called them the New Jersey Nets, but I can't go as in depth there, but I can offer, I guess, a more unbiased approach, like a look at things, because I'm not like living and breathing. Even if you're not a fan of the team, if you cover them, you always give them the benefit of the doubt, I feel like, in a lot of situations. So I feel like it helps me to just kind of take a step back and look at things with the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you are into sort of the weeds of the NBA as a fan or as an analyst or whatever you are, content creator, I think sometimes it can be hard to see the forest for the trees, which is why oftentimes, we have that centric folks on this. And it's great to not have that sometimes because it gives you a more bird's eye view. And I think sometimes with the NBA, you just have to have a bird's eye view to really understand the overall landscape. So I will put the link in the show notes. Matt wrote a really fantastic article for the Analyst that breaks down the case about sort of the improvement and maybe the upside of Nic Claxton. The article is called "The Other Slim Reaper Is Nets Big Man Nic Claxton, a Two-Way Star in the Making." I will put the link for this in the show notes. We'll cover some of what happens here, what Matt kind of covered on it, but I would really suggest to anyone that is interested in this to go read the full article, because there's no possible way in 30 minutes we can touch on everything that kind of Matt breaks down as making the case for Claxton as this sort of like maybe star in the making. Great title, by the way. As someone that lives and dies with titles, this one was a great one. So to start here, what, as someone who covers the NBA, who can write about, presumably anything you want in terms of things you're interested in, what made you want to really focus, 1,000+ words on Nic Claxton and really go deep into what he's doing this season?
Yeah, well, okay, so, as just to give you guys a little bit background of how my process works, I have like a big bulletin board. So my goal this year is to write at least one article on all 30 teams. So I have like under each team, like little storylines that I might try to explore. And I'd heard on a podcast earlier this year, somebody made a joke that Nic Claxton was looking like Kevin Garnett on defense a little bit. And, as like a big Kevin Garnett guy, that kind of, perked my ears up. I'm like, okay, wait a second. Cause I hadn't watched too much Nets in the beginning of the year because of just too many guys in and out of the lineup. It didn't seem like a good use of my time to focus on a team that wasn't going to be, the team they would be at their full form. And I'd heard this thing about Claxton, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to bookmark that, and we'll look into it a little bit later on. And then I was watching the Raptors Nets game from a couple Fridays ago, the Kyrie Irving shot,
Mhm.
and I know the Raptors got off to a really hot start in the first half, and then in the third quarter, Nic Claxton really just changed the game defensively with some of the blocks, the rim deterrence. There was this one play where he like got switched on to Fred VanVleet, and he like swallowed Fred VanVleet's entry pass into the post, and it just um took it down the other side of the court. And I was just like, okay, I think it's time to start digging into Claxton more, because I was so impressed by what I'd seen. And so yeah, that's kind of what inspired this entire little venture.
And it's funny too, because I think your progression on getting into Claxton here follows, frankly, probably where the fan is, where the Nets folk, the group of Nets folks is around this guy, where it's been this like sort of slow progression. Then all of a sudden you wake up one day and he's part of like the national discussion, and it's been
Mhm.
happening incrementally, like, as time goes on, and then now more and more, and then some of the stats back it up, which we'll get to. And it passes the eye test also, which I think for a lot of Nets fans is really important. Really, just anybody is really important. It needs to pass this, like, eye test, even around what lay fans do. That game that Matt was referring to, by the way, the Nets were down, and they had that third quarter was a 36-22 run, where they just completely shut down what the Raptors were trying to do on offense. So let's start with, where this starts for Claxton as a defender. Because we'll get to the offensive piece in a second, but I think defense is where he's really been making his bones, and has been for a little while, but is clearly taking a leap this year. What are some things that stood out to you about his game defensively that, starts to put him in this conversation? Maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but like above, maybe we're talking about like sort of upper echelon defenders in the NBA. Like, what about his game actually is like, either statistically or eye test wise is kind of standing out to you?
Yeah, I think there's two big things that really Claxton brings on the defensive end. One is like the positional versatility, the switchability, which we'll get at in just a second. And the other is the rim protection. But a general rule, like one of my truisms with basketball, because great coaches, they base their schemes off of their personnel. They don't have like these overarching philosophies. Like there's no coach, most NBA coaches, there's no NBA coach who says like, oh, no matter what the team, we're gonna play like drop. You know what I mean? No, it's just like what you have, we're gonna make the most out of that. And the Nets have just a absurd amount of like length, um and pretty good mobility, agility, right? And their best defender, Nic Claxton, is like super switchable. So basically, what the Nets do is they switch everything almost all the time. And it does come with some drawbacks, because sometimes you'll end up with like Kyrie Irving on Kristaps Porzingis, but it's switching in a vacuum in the regular season is like a really effective way to build a good defense. Because what offenses are always trying to do is they're trying to get like to use a hockey term, they're trying to get a power play going, where it's basically one guy creates an advantage, and he brings a second defender into his little purview, and he can kick the ball out, and now the rest of his team is basically playing a 4-on-3 game for a couple seconds. I think the best example of that, and I reference it in the article, is the way the Minnesota Timberwolves guarded John Morant in the playoffs last year, where basically anytime John Morant would get a pick and roll, they would bring the big man up towards him. They would hedge, they call it, in his little space. So basically, they would hedge him, bring two defenders at the ball. John Morant would quickly um, get the ball out of his hands. And then Memphis was working with a 4-on-3 power play. If you look at like a guy like Desmond Bane's stats from that series, he plays really well, and it's partially because like he's getting a lot of these open shots on the 4-on-3 power play. But when you can switch with a guy like Claxton, you're never really conceding the 4-on-3 power play, because not only is Claxton going to, like, say, you win that Toronto game, they would run like a pick and roll with Fred VanVleet and like Pascal Siakam, right? And Claxton originally on, Siakam switches on to VanVleet. VanVleet can't, and VanVleet's not one of the best, like, interior finishers among guards, but still, he can't blow by Claxton and then force a second defender to come in. Like, Claxton stays with him step for step. And we're going to talk in a second about the one type of player that gives Claxton fits on defense. But for the most part, this guy, in terms of like just one-on-one matchups, has very few weaknesses when it comes to like who he can stay with step for step. And that's just such a huge thing, because it avoids putting this Nets team in rotation and really, putting a strain on the defense.
Okay, I want to get into, who might be some problem players for Claxton. Want to get into some of these stats that Matt was able to break down in this article that really, from a statistical level, are able to show people maybe what your eyes are already seeing. We're going to get into that in a second. First, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. We've been talking about Prize Picks for a while now. That's because it's daily fantasy made easy. It's super easy to use. You're not worried about wrangling salaries. You're not worried about going up against all these sharks in the water. You're just making entries on Prize Picks. You're going more or less than the player projections, and that is it. More or less in the points, more or less in the rebounds, more or less in the assists. I could go through all the different offerings they have here. We'd be all here all day, and you get bored, but that's okay. You want the time to go over to Prize Picks. All you do, you pick 2 to 6 players. You figure out if they're going to go more or less on the Prize Picks projection. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. Like I said, you're not going up against other people, just you versus the projections. And oh my gosh, the sports, NBA, NFL, NHL, PGA golf going to be starting here pretty soon. MLB when that season starts, and the list goes on and on over at Prize Picks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's super easy, safe and fast withdrawals. Currently operational in over 30 states, and our friends over in Canada. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100. You just got to use the promo code Locked On, like our podcast network. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. All right, we'll get to the maybe the problematic player here in a second. Walk people through with Claxton, because I definitely want to go through that, and I also want to go and answer the eternal question that Nets fans have about bringing in possibly another big, which I think Matt has a different kind of answer than we've been giving, and I think I'm always refreshed to hear different opinions on this kind of stuff. Go through a couple if you can. You mentioned drip in the article as a way to sort of look at how defenders can really match up against other players. You also talk about the different percentages, the DIF percentage when it comes to relating to Claxton in terms of what some of these metrics that show sort of what he's doing on defense, either as an isolation defender, as a help defender. Like, go through some of that stuff that backs up this, like, I mean, we can maybe make a case. I don't know if we want to get into defensive player of the year territory here or not, but you can squash that if you don't want to go there. But walk us through some of the numbers that back up sort of what Claxton's doing here.
Yeah, I mean, not to burst anybody's bubble, but I would say he's like a firm tier below like the defensive player of the year candidates. I mean, that's not like a knock on the guy, because there's 350 players in the NBA. I mean, 450 players in the NBA. So if you're like in that second tier of defenders in the entire league, that means you're like a really, really, really good defender.
And real quick, let me just say one thing real quick about that. Like, just as a note, because sometimes markets are pretty good about sussing some of this stuff out. Like, in terms of player of the year, defensive player of the year odds right now, he does sit like 18th, which you're like, oh my God, it's so low. Because it's like, oh, he's been so great. But then the guys above him, it's like Brooke Lopez, Jaren Jackson Jr., Giannis, like guys that are obviously are like significantly better defenders. But I think having him even mentioned in this thing is like not something that would have happened at the beginning of the season. Like he never did. I know for a fact, because I looked, like he did not sit this high. Anyway, sorry to cut you off, but I just wanted to throw in there like where this sits tiers wise.
No, that's a great call because again, like their algorithms are always spot on. I mentioned the really fast. I mentioned drip in the article because that's the website's one number metric. But my favorite defensive one number metric is defensive EPM. You can find that on dunksandthrees.com. I like that one because it incorporates the tracking data with the plus minus data. But Claxton, the last time I checked, which was last week, and I don't think it's changed too much, but he was in the 98th percentile in the entire league in that metric, which is like a really good indicator that he's really good. He's a really goddamn good defender. But so big men, here's another truism with basketball. Big men are generally the most important defenders because they protect the most important part of the floor, which is the paint. The paint, again, is home of the easiest, most efficient shot in basketball outside of the free throw, but also coincidentally, the free throw is often garnered by getting into the paint. So again, having a guy who can defend that area is immensely valuable in Claxton. So a couple of weeks ago, one of my really good friends, Cody Hodek, was on his podcast, the Thinking Basketball podcast, and he was talking a lot about how in today's game you need to have two rim protectors on the floor because to go back to another pretty important playoff series in the last couple of years, you remember when the Clippers played the Jazz a couple of years back, and their big thing to come back in that series was to start playing 5 out and get Rudy Gobert from away from the paint to the perimeter, and like everyone's
And they
like,
had no one else, and they had like, and the Jazz was like, it was like Bojan Bogdanovic was like the next biggest guy, and it was a total disaster. Yes, yeah,
exactly. And so with the Nets, their team's really cool because sometimes like they'll have like Watanabe, Durant, and Claxton all on the floor. So like the Nets naturally switch everything. So like teams might say, okay, Kevin Durant's having a really good shot blocking year. Let's switch him on a guy who's on the perimeter so Durant is no longer near the paint and can't help out. Well, then you have Nic Claxton waiting there. And I mean, Durant's done a good job at blocking shots. Watanabe's done a good job blocking shots. Even to some degree, Ben Simmons has done a solid job protecting the rim. But Claxton's been, I called him like the head honcho. He's been the main guy at not only blocking shots, but so I didn't write this in the article, but I call like there's like you remember Hassan Whiteside when he had his huge run in the NBA, where he was like blocking shots left and right. There's like the Hassan Whiteside type rim protector where they're intentionally hunting like blocks, and that can be helpful at times, galvanize the team, of course. But Claxton's not only blocking shots, but he's like altering like the way people shoot around the rim. He's got one of the best like up field goal differentials. It's diff on NBA.com. Basically, it calculates like a player's field goal percentage against Claxton compared to their average, and like, Claxton's is one of the best differentials in the NBA among guys who contest a lot of shots like Claxton does. So he has, along with that switchability, he has the ability to protect the paint, not to the degree of like a Rudy Gobert, but like maybe like a notch below that. But on top of that, he adds in something Gobert doesn't really have, which is the switchability we talked about. And when you kind of combine those two prongs, you have like this guy we keep talking about as like, like a top 15-ish defender in the NBA, which is like, again, when there's 450 NBA players, that's really, really good.
Right, like there's more. You're not getting to like the best defender on every team at that point. So it's just trying to like set like some a baseline for people to understand that like this being ranked among this group is still like as high as you can get. And I think you make a good point too about, and I think some people sort of misunderstand this at times about like how important it is to have a big long defender or have your center or whatever be your best defender. This is like kind of like the joke about Marcus Smart winning defensive player of the year. It's like, how could that even be possible when it's like not when it's not having stuff near the rim? I don't, well, you're shaking your head. I don't know if you agree with me or disagree.
No, I 100% agree with you. I just like my thing with it. I've come to this with the defensive player of the year award. We're never, because like if we did it based, it's kind of like the MVP. If we did it based on like the true like best defensive player in the league, it would probably get like redundant, and people would get annoyed. So like I feel like it's just like if you win defensive player of the year, that's just an indication that you're like one of the best defenders at your position. You
Yeah.
know, that like that's all we should really take from it when we're doing like the analysis side of things. And I think like Smart had a really great defensive year last year. He's a really great defender. He does a lot for that Boston Celtics defense. He's probably one of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA. And I think he deserved to like, be honored and praised. He's just not the best defender in the league. Maybe not even the best defender on his team. But that's a different story for a different day.
Totally. If there was, I want to get to some of these other big men here in a second. We haven't even gotten to the offensive side of Claxton's game. But if you saw is there a hole in his game? Like, is there something that you could actually see him improving on that could like make? Is there like another level he can get to at this point, in terms of defensively? Because I think it's sometimes nice to rest on your laurels and be like, wow, we got something Nets wise, got something. I would say significantly better. I mean, definitely outplaying his contract for sure right now. But is there another level that he can actually get to where he is? Is there something he can improve on to actually get him into that first tier?
So okay, like we're gonna talk a little bit about their weakness as a team. They don't have much girth.
Yep.
Is a good word to say it, but like I don't think like I want Claxton to be adding girth on because like I think that takes away from a lot of his strengths, like the agility, the mobility. But so I think the thing that like a lot of people get wrong is when they think of defensive versatility, they think of like a guy who is switchy. You know what I mean? I think that's what people get wrong about the Toronto Raptors all the time, where they think they're like a really versatile defensive team, but like they're positionally versatile defensively. They can guard a bunch of different positions, all their guys, but they can't actually play a bunch of different ways. They play that one like hyper aggressive, turnover inducing style. And with Brooklyn, like they are very switchy, but like that's kind of their only move defensively. And I think that's partially because Claxton, he's just like, he's not much of a drop guy yet. And I think that would be big if he could become like a better drop defender where, the Nets wouldn't always have to concede matchups where like, they're putting Kyrie Irving on these bigger guys. Like imagine you play like Milwaukee and they're trying to get Kyrie Irving switched on like Giannis. Like, you don't want that. So like if you can get Claxton to play a style where he's able to kind of stay attached on Giannis, Kyrie's able to stay attached to the ball handler, things of that nature more consistently. I think that would be really huge just to add like again another punch because the postseason, we're going to talk about this in a second where we talk about where the Nets are in the Eastern Conference. Postseason is so much about matchups, especially if you're not like this world beating team which like I think the Nets are really, really good. I don't think they're the best team in NBA history though. And so matchups are going to be so important. So if you can give yourself just different types of cards to play in the playoffs, that's just huge.
All right, we're going to get into, as promised, some of these other big men that have been sort of bandied about in Nets world. Want to touch on Claxton's offensive game, where that's landed him this season. Have Matt give us sort of like a NBA layout of where the Nets are, maybe just in terms of the rest of the league. We're going to do that in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Bet Online. You know Bet Online, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. And boy, there are a lot. Go over to Bet Online and take a look at the list. You'll be inundated with just some sports you never even heard of, leagues you definitely never heard of. It's all there at Bet Online. Pro football to college football heading into bowl season here. They got the basketball. They got NHL rolling every single night. It's all there at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, they have those as well. That's the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head on over to betonline.net. You can learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts. All right, let me just touch on this because I teased this at the beginning and I never got there. There's a group of Nets fans that do want to bring in a certain kind of defender. I'm going to throw the names out here that we get it's become less. Claxton's been so good. Actually, it's a testament to how good Claxton's been that these actually are coming less and less. At the beginning of the season, it was literally every single day, either in YouTube comments or for me on Twitter or somewhere, these were the names that we've thrown out as the Nets, quote, need to have these guys. DeMarcus Cousins, so Boogie Cousins, Hassan Whiteside's in there. Dwight Howard's a fan favorite of guys that they want to bring in. These are three guys that aren't in the league at all right now. Mo Bamba's another guy that gets thrown out there as like wanting to make a trade. I think I got pretty much the group there. Maybe Bamba doesn't fit that group, but the other three are guys that are just sort of sitting out there to be had by any team. There's a contingent and a cadre of Nets fans that would love to bring one of these sort of bigger guys in. Do you see that as like a viable move for the Nets to make? Do you think, like you mentioned, the lack of girth, and I agree with you about having on this team. Do you see that actually as a viable move that the team could make that would make them better? I've been against this, but I think that I have a feeling you're going to give a different answer.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's go into the matchups thing, right? Well, first of all, let's look at some things that kind of, when I say the girth thing, some things that lead me towards that. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but if you look right now at their defensive rebounding percentage, offensive rebounding percentage, very, very low, right towards the bottom of the league. And then you look at like Claxton's foul rates, kind of high. And that all indicates to me that like Claxton's one weakness as a defender is he doesn't have like that old school, like I can bang with you down there in the low block. Like if it's like a Joel Embiid or a Jonas Valanciunas. And like the way the NBA is gone, like that's fine for in most matchups, but there still lies a couple of those old school classical big men. And like, there's a very, very real possibility that in the first round, the Brooklyn Nets play the Philadelphia 76ers. And while I still want Claxton playing like a good chunk of minutes in that game, you do want somebody you can throw in there for like 8 to 10 to 12 minutes that can just eat some fouls for you. You know what I mean? It's not even like you're relying on them to do anything extraordinary or even like average. You just like eat some fouls. Like I remember when the Suns played the Milwaukee Bucks in the finals a couple of years back. One of the big things was like Ayton was doing a really good job at guarding Giannis, and the Suns played well when Ayton was on the floor, but he couldn't stay on the floor because he kept like they didn't have anyone to eat the fouls for him. Like Dario Saric tore his ACL, I think, in game 1 or 2. And I think that gets lost in the sauce when we talk about that series because it would have been huge to have Sarge just play the 5 for like 8 or 10 minutes in those other games, eat some of the fouls that Ayton was taking on, and so that Ayton could play more. But I think that's the same kind of thing we need with Claxton, where it's like you bring in a guy. Maybe it's like I kind of like the Dwight Howard one because like he's just happy to be there. I feel like at this point, as opposed to just being in street clothes. So like during the regular season, you don't really need to worry about playing him too much, and then you kind of throw him in there for those like situational matchups. Because again, I don't think the Nets, if we like tier them out in teams, like they're not. I don't think there's any team in the NBA. Maybe the Celtics where they're just like on their own level, kind of like dominant. But I for sure don't think the Nets are there. So like they need to be able to win. They need to be able to play a bunch of different ways. And I think adding in a girthier body would help them do that.
Yeah, and that series was Frank Kamenetsky, and it wasn't going to work, right? It was in that Sun series, like that was who they were kind of bringing in to eat some of that stuff. And we've talked about this before, as like I've done a baseball analogy with this as like an innings eater, right? It's like, hey,
exactly.
It's not the worst thing. We said this at the beginning of the season. It's like not the worst thing to have Andre Drummond eating 15 minutes a game in the regular season to just make sure, one, that like everyone's healthy, and then two, it doesn't matter as much, right?
It's funny you mentioned Drummond because I feel like him and Blake Griffin, the two guys you guys had on the roster last year, would have been like perfect for this. Like, just big, girthy guy.
To some degree, they have this in Sharp, and they just don't want to play him. Like they just they have this, and they have like a big, kind of little bit slow, but kind of has energy kind of guy in Day'Ron Sharp. They just don't seem to want to do it, right? And for whatever reason.
Here's my one stipulation though about that. I do want, if I'm going to bring in this professional bruiser, I'd prefer for him to be a veteran because you get the institutional knowledge. Yeah. So like you might get those moments in the playoffs where they have like a really nice like swipe down on Joel Embiid in the post, and just those little things that the veterans kind of carry with them that like a young guy like Sharp who's still like plenty raw. Like I prefer like it take like 10 minutes for you to get your 6 fouls instead of like 5. Like where am I with Sharp if he was to get matched up with a locked in Embiid in a postseason series?
Yeah. So, well, this is gonna be music to like. There's gonna be a certain. We'll definitely hear about this. You can at me with all this and say you can do it. I told you so because someone else came in and said the Nets should get one of these guys. I've been fighting the good fight against this for a while, but yeah, I can sometimes see it. All right, real quick, Claxton's offensive game. Because you do mention in the title of the article and then make a case for it too about calling him definitively calling him a two-way player, right? So we've focused almost primarily on the defense here up until this point. When you call him a two-way player, What are you sort of seeing in his game that's making it so that it's not just like this one-dimensional guy? Like, what is he bringing on the offensive end that is, because at this point, to reach the highest levels in the NBA for a team, like you do need to have guys that do it all on both ends of the court as much as possible. Like you can only get away with a certain thing for so long. Does Claxton have this in his game to be able to play high leverage minutes from the offensive side of things? Like, are you seeing that enough from what he's kind of putting out there right now?
Well, I mean, the first like great indicator of Claxton's offensive game is, I mean, the last time I checked, he was leading the league in true shooting, which
Yeah,
is like the best
he has
measure.
been all year, by the way. I
Yeah,
think it's like he might go wire to wire with this because it was even when the Nets were bad, the true shooting was like unreal.
exactly. And like that's like, I mean, true shooting is the number one indicator of scoring efficiency. So like that, it shows like he's efficient. I think that I mentioned this in the article that he's like underutilized offensively just because like the Nets stylistically are not like a pick and roll heavy team. Like if he was on Atlanta and he was just like him and Trae Young, like I think he would be like a 17, 18 point per game scorer probably. So like I do think he's got like a lot of utility as a rim runner, as like a guy in the dunker spot kind of hanging out when the defense collapses on the driver. He's like a nice little lay down option. The team as a whole is bad at offensive rebounding, but not Nic Claxton. He's a really good offensive rebounder. He's probably like the only guy in the team who can consistently offensive rebound. So he has that, and he can get like easy putbacks off of that. I think he's really high up percentile wise in putback efficiency. By the way, I think I might have said it in the article. I don't remember. But my big problem with him. So it's funny, I watched that Toronto game. I'm sure you remember Watanabe closes that game, hits that big corner three on the Kyrie Irving drive. And, in my notes, I kind of wrote down, I'm like, why didn't Claxton close this game? Like he was incredible in the third quarter. And then on the side, I'm like, okay, maybe like Coach Vaughn was just kind of riding Watanabe because like he was playing really well in the fourth quarter. And then I watched, I think it was, what game was it? Where they hack a Claxton. It was one of their games in the win streak where Claxton started getting, I think actually it might have been one of the only game they've lost in the last like 13 games against the Celtics. I think that might have been it. But they started like intentionally fouling him, and I'm like, I saw him miss a free throw, and I do a quick basketball reference as he's winding up for a second free throw. I'm like, oh, this guy shoots 44% from the free throw line.
Yeah.
Now I see why he doesn't close any games. So I think that right there is like the huge thing for Claxton because like if you're a 60% free throw shooter, that means you average 1.2 points per possession on free throws, which is like really, really, it's not like the hyper efficiency of the great free throw shooters, but that's way better than like half court offense. So if he can get it to like 60% free throw shooting, he becomes like way more playable down the stretch. But right now, it's like 44%. It's just, yeah, it makes it tough to play him close in games, which is like a big knock, especially when we're talking about the playoffs where, there's a lot of close games because the stakes are pretty high. So I think that's like the big thing if he can fix that.
Well, can I say one thing about that?
Yes,
I'm just gonna jump.
yes.
I'm jumping in over you here, but I want to just point out something. He had in the last like 6 games. It's been documented, and you can see it. He's actually had he's actually changed his style. Like he's actually shooting them differently than he has been before. He's doing it more with a very pronounced stop at the top of the release. It's actually caused in the Bucks game. It caused 2 lane violations by the Bucks because they were expecting the ball to leave his hand, right? But he's like stopping at the very top, at the top of the release and doing it. Since he changed, it's very small sample size, but he's 8 for his last 12 and hitting 75% of his free throws. I don't know if that's going to be a long-term stick, I don't know if it's sticky in terms of what it's going to do, but there's been he changed something. It's very clear. And the results in the short term have followed. So I don't know. I'm just throwing it in there because like I can see someone coming at me and saying something about that.
That's the nuance I miss right there. And that's why we have guys like you who do the wonderful day-to-day stuff, and I lean on guys like you to help me as I
there's no way to know that. Like you'd have to be like following like Eric Slater who got a picture of it and then watch it in the game. Like it's a whole thing, So anyway, go ahead.
But so I mean if that sticks, I think with the rim running and the offensive rebounding and all that play finishing he can do around the rim, I think he becomes an average offensive player for that position. And then when you combine that with the immense value he provides defensively, you're looking at a guy where if you're a championship contender, like he can play, like he can be in your starting lineup and you could still like feel like you're a championship contender. And I think that's like just huge for this guy who like he wasn't like this coveted, like high end first round pick. I don't know when they picked him, but it's just like Claxton isn't like he wasn't. I'm trying to think of the guys in his age range, but he wasn't like highly touted, highly coveted prospect coming in. So like for him to become this kind of guy for the Nets, even last season, like he was like a promising player, but I never thought he'd be this. So for him to become that, that's like just a huge positive for this Nets team as they try to figure things out around Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant.
Yeah, I think he was like 23rd. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, 30. He was 31st in the
Mhm.
2019 draft. And he's had a bunch of injuries too, which is like kind of cut down on his just overall playing time, which I think is what we're seeing too. I want to get into the Nets as we close out here. I want to get into the Nets like sort of top end, like where you can maybe see this team going. But just in terms of his overall play, like he dealt with so many injuries over the first couple of years that I think it was just sort of time on task. Like he just didn't play enough, right? Like he didn't play enough to like really sort of start putting all together. He's finally healthy. Like he's playing enough minutes to just kind of iron out some of these parts in his game. It's funny too, because like he missed time. You talk about like those like sort of pick and roll, sort of like when he could become a rim runner. The Nets had guys like this on the team with Harden, and even Dinwiddie was like this, right? With like he would
Mhm.
be able to run 2-man pick and roll toward the rim, but he never got time enough to play with those guys because he was just injured all the time. So he never saw what that actually could look like. Other than just there's a bunch of these guys are total dust in terms of guys who were drafted around them. All right. In terms of where the Nets, as we get going here and out the door, I really appreciate Matt taking all this time here to break down this Claxton thing. Where do you see, just as a guy watching the NBA as a whole, right, taking time every day, and Matt walked me through his process a little bit at the beginning of the day. It's like it's watching a lot of hoops, right, of like and watching at a very high level too. Where do you see the Nets? Where do you see them, like, just in terms of like the whole NBA right now? What do you see as maybe like the upside, if there is? Like, are there moves you can make? You can kind of take this any direction you want, but like in terms of comparatively to the entire league, where do you see the Nets right now?
Yeah, so let's just to keep things like to narrow the focus a little, let's keep things on the Eastern Conference side. My tiers kind of go so it's basically like this for me, where it's like I think Milwaukee and Boston are in their own little tier. I think those are like the two best teams in the East. But after that, I think it's like I really think Cleveland and Philly. I mean, not Philly, excuse me. Cleveland and Brooklyn are in that next tier, and I might include Philly with this recent hot stretch. I still want to see what it looks like when Maxi's on the floor, but I really think that yeah, Brooklyn's in that second tier. And what I mean by that second tier, it's like I don't think they're like we said. I don't think they're world beaters. I think if they can get the right kind of pathway through the conference, I could see them like making it out of the conference and being in the NBA finals. Like if they get like the right type of matchups based on how their team looks at the end of the year, I think they do have. I mean, we can talk about this on a different pod. I think there is like a couple weaknesses on this team. One of them being, the girth thing we talked about. That if they play the wrong matchup, it could get tricky. But yeah, I'm really sold on this team. Depending on the day, sometimes I think they're the third best team in the East, and the third best team in the East has like a really good chance of making it out of the East, depending on how things break for them. So yeah, this is a very very good team, which you probably wouldn't have thought when they started out the season like 2-5 or whatever
Oh,
it was.
dude, please no. Like this run's been unbelievable. It's like
Yeah.
there's no way. If you went back and listened to the early season podcast, I mean, it was like you needed to take some kind of like prescription medication. It was like it was rough in these streets, man. But like it
Mhm.
was no, but the turnaround here has been exceptional. I know. I'm sure I'm going to just get out ahead of this right now. What people are going to say here is like, oh well, the Nets just beat the Bucks and the Nets just beat the Cavs.
Yeah,
So
I
like
knew.
what?
I knew
But
I shouldn't. I should have been a little bit more.
it's okay, no, because I think that one, the sample size is super small.
Mhm.
Two, I think you have to at some point look at sort of like historical stuff, specifically with the Bucks, and just like you have to. It's irresponsible to not put them on a different level. Like they've already been to the other level, right? With the Nets, it's just prognostication. You're hoping that it's going to be that way. And 7-game series are different than 1 game. So I'm only pushing it out there to get out ahead of what I think will be a comment. And like that, it's fine. It's like it's okay for the Nets. Two things can be true. The Nets can be really good right now, and the Bucks just have Giannis and can be better. Like there's and we've seen it. We've seen them roll all the way through different playoff scenarios. So anyway, I think that I believe this is to say I agree with you, and this is really really cool where the Nets are right now. Really appreciate Matt taking the time here. I'm going to put I mentioned at the beginning, I will put the link in the show notes at theanalyst.com is where Matt did this, and does a bunch of other work. Go and make sure you follow him at Mat Issa 15. That's MATISSA 15 on Twitter. He's just dropping tons and tons of knowledge. If you want to get smarter about the NBA, you have to follow guys like this. I don't really know what else to tell you. Like, this is how you can get away with not watching every game and getting smarter about basketball, because guys like Matt do all the work for you. Matt, really appreciate the time. Thanks for making the case for Claxton here.
No, thank you so much for having me, Doug. It was a lot of fun.
All right, Matt, really appreciate it. Matt, excuse me, not Matt. Unfortunately, it'll be Adam and I after the game, following the game on Wednesday. We'll be coming live on YouTube, but really appreciate everyone that's been jumping over onto YouTube. Make sure you follow Locked On Nets over on YouTube so you know when we're going live. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.